Good morning, everybody. It's morning right now, and it's raining in Southern California. And the tree trimmers came from our city, and they trimmed the trees that are on the side of the house, so I won't have as many trees to rake in the fall. That's good news. And I'm going to read the last chapter of Flat Stanley, and it's called Arthur's Good Idea. Has your brother or sister ever had a good idea? For a while, Stanley Lambchop was a famous name. Everywhere that Stanley went, people stared and pointed at him. He could hear them whisper, "Over there, Agnes, over there. That must be Stanley Lambchop, the one who caught the sneak thieves," and things like that. But after a few weeks, the whispering probably got old for Stanley, and the staring stopped. People had other things to think about. Stanley did not mind. Being famous had been fun, but enough was enough. And then came a further change, and it was not a pleasant one. People began to laugh and make fun of him as he passed by. "Hello, Super Skinny," they would shout, and even ruder things about the way he looked. Stanley told his parents how he felt. "It's the other kids I mostly mind," he said. "They don't like me anymore because I'm different. I'm flat." "Shame on them," said Mrs. Lambchop. "It's wrong to dislike people for their shapes, or their religion for that matter, or the color of their skin." "I know," Stanley said. "Only maybe it's impossible for everybody to like everybody." "Perhaps," said Mrs. Lambchop, "but they can try." Later that night, Arthur Lambchop was awoken by the sound of crying. In the darkness, he crept across the room and knelt by Stanley's bed. "Are you okay, Stanley?" he said. "Go away," Stanley said. "Don't be mad at me," Arthur said. "You're still mad because I let you get tangled the day you were my kite, I guess." "Skip it, will you?" Stanley said. "I'm not mad. Go away." "Please, let's be friends." Arthur couldn't help but cry a little bit too. "Oh, Stanley," he said, "please tell me what's wrong." Stanley waited for a long time before he spoke. "The thing is, I'm just not happy anymore. I'm tired of being flat. I want to be a regular shape again like other people, but I'll have to go on being flat forever. It makes me sick." "Oh, Stanley," Arthur said. He dried his tears on a corner of Stanley's sheet and could think of nothing more to say. Oh, look at the two of them sitting there together, and Arthur's trying to comfort Stanley. It would be hard to be flat, wouldn't it? "Don't talk about what I just said," Stanley told him. "I don't want Mom and Dad to worry. That'd only make it worse." "You're brave," Arthur said. "You really are." He took hold of Stanley's hand. The two brothers sat together in the darkness, being friends. They were both still sad, but each one felt a little better than he had before. And then suddenly, though he was not even trying to think, Arthur had an idea. He jumped up, turned on the light, and ran to the storage box where the toys were kept. He began to rummage in the box. Stanley sat up in bed to watch. Arthur flung aside a football and some lead soldiers and airplane models and blocks. Aha! He found what he wanted, an old bicycle pump. He held it up, and Stanley and he looked at each other. "Okay," Stanley said at last, "but take it easy." He put the end of the long pump hose in his mouth, and he clamped his lips tightly about it so that no air would escape. "I'll go slowly," Arthur said. "If it hurts or anything, wiggle your hand at me." He began to pump. At first, nothing happened except that Stanley's cheeks bulged a bit. Arthur watched his hand, but there was no wiggle signal, so he pumped on. Then suddenly Stanley's top half began to swell. "It's working! It's working!" shouted Arthur, pumping away. Stanley spread his arms so that the air could get around inside him more easily. He got bigger and bigger, and the buttons burst off his pajamas. Pop, pop, pop! A moment more and he was all rounded out. Head and body, arms and legs, but not his right foot. That foot stayed flat. Arthur stopped pumping. "It's like trying to do the very last bit of those long balloons," he said. "Maybe a shake would help." Stanley shook his foot twice, and with a little whooshing sound, it swelled out to match the left one. There stood Stanley Lambchop as he used to be, as if he had never been flat at all. Now this is Stanley getting pumped up by his brother. Look at that. What a great idea Arthur had. And it worked. Wow. Stanley is himself again. Thank you, Arthur, Stanley said. Thank you very much. The brothers were shaking hands when Mr. Lambchop strode into the room with Mrs. Lambchop right behind him. We heard you, said Mr. Lambchop. Up and talking when you ought to be asleep, eh? Shame on George, said Mrs. Lambchop. Stanley's round again. You're right, said Mr. Lambchop, noticing. Good for you, Stanley. I'm the one who did it, Arthur said. I blew him up. Everyone was terribly excited and happy. Of course, Mrs. Lambchop made hot chocolate to celebrate the occasion. Look at that. They're all going to just stay up and celebrate a while. They're so happy for Stanley. And several toasts were drunk to Arthur for his cleverness. When the little party was over, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop tucked the boys back into their beds and kissed them. And they turned out the light. Good night, they said. Good night, said Stanley and Arthur. It had been a long and tiring day. Very soon all the Lambchops were asleep. And you know, this is just the very first Flat Stanley book that was written. And there's a lot more of them. There's Flat Stanley's Worldwide Adventures and Flat Stanley and the Magic Lamp, Invisible Stanley, Stanley in Space. So just a whole bunch of books. If you liked Flat Stanley, you could go to the library and check out some more Flat Stanley books and see what other adventures he has happened to him. Another book I'm going to read that I always love reading to my grandkids is The Three Little Pigs. And this one kind of has a different ending. So I'm going to read this one to you all. The Three Little Pigs. Once there were 3 little pigs. They set out into the great big forest to look for a nice spot to build homes. The first little pig gathered up straw to build his house. Swish, swash, swish. The second little pig gathered up, remember what he gathered? That's right, sticks to build his house. Plickety, plackety, plick. And the third little pig gathered up, you're right, he gathered all the bricks to build his house. Ploppity, cloppity, clop. Just look at those pigs with their straw and their sticks and their bricks. I wonder what you'd build your house out of. The first 2 pigs finished their houses in no time. They said to the third pig, you're working too hard. Why don't you come play? But he kept right on building. Clink, clonk, plop, swack. Finally, he was all finished. He relaxed by a warm fire in his safe and very strong house. I think he was a smart pig, don't you? One day, a big bad wolf came to the straw house of the first little pig. He could smell a kettle of soup. It made him very hungry. He said, little pig, let me in. But the first little pig replied, not by the hair of my chinny chin chin. So the wolf said, then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in. And with a swoosh and a whoosh, the straw house blew away. The first little pig jumped up and ran all the way to the second little pig's house. Hurry, pig, run fast, fast, faster. The next day, the big bad wolf came to the house of the second little pig. He could smell a fresh loaf of bread baking in the oven. He said, little pig, let me come in. Not by the hair of my chinny chin chin, cried the second little pig. Then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in. With a gust of air and a crack and a crash, oh, the stick house fell to the ground. And both pigs jumped up and they ran all the way to the third little pig's house. Whoa, that wolf is very good at blowing. When the third little pig heard about the wolf, he was glad his brothers were safe. You must be hungry and tired. Sit down and have some pie. The big bad wolf came to the third pig's house and he smelled the pie. He said, little pig, let me in. Not by the hair of my chinny chin chin, cried the third little pig. So the wolf said, then I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in. So he huffed and he puffed and he huffed and he puffed and he huffed and he puffed And guess what? The little brick house wouldn't fall. Oh my goodness, look at that wolf just huffing and puffing and trying as hard as he could. The wolf had never had this happen before. He sat down in an old log, and guess what he did? He began to cry. Oh, the third little pig said, there, Mr. Wolf. You don't have to be so sad. You have a remarkable talent. You can use your talent for better things than blowing down houses. I have an idea, said the third little pig. Listen. Outside the woods, they heard the sounds of children laughing and playing. It was the local fair, and everyone was going. I wonder what he's going to suggest that the wolf can do. The three little pigs and the big bad wolf all went down to the fair. Here's a wonderful way to use your talent, said the third little pig. With a huff and a puff, the wolf started blowing up the colorful balloons. All the children came to see the fun sizes and shapes. The wolf was happy and amazed to have so many new friends. He wasn't bad or sad anymore. He was now the big, glad wolf. While the big, bad, glad wolf huffed and puffed, the first little pig sold straw baskets. The second little pig played the fiddle. And the third little pig sat peacefully under the shade of an oak tree, smiling. And that is the end of the three little pigs and the big, glad wolf. And I'm going to read one more George and Martha story. And this one is called The Job. What type of job would you like to have when you're older? Or maybe you have some jobs now, some chores that you do. Well, this one is called The Job. George was excited about his new job. It's hard work, said Martha. You must be very strict. I'll try, said George. No horsing around is allowed, said Martha. Thanks for the advice, said George. That's what friends are for, said Martha. Can you figure out what type of job George is doing? That's right. It looks like he's maybe going to be a lifeguard. Very soon, George saw that someone was disobeying the rules. No horsing around, he called through his megaphone. It's all right, shouted Martha. It's only me. You heard me, called out George. Look at that, Martha. She's not obeying the rules, is she? George meant business, and he gave Martha quite a bawling out. Well, said Martha, and I thought we were friends. Oh dear, said George. Martha was right. This is a hard job. Yeah, it's hard when you have to do a job like that, and you have to be the one to tell people to do the right thing. That's not easy. So I'm going to say goodbye for now. And I'll read some more stories tomorrow. And I love you so much. And let me throw you all a kiss. Mwah. Did everyone catch it? I got yours back. Mwah. Thank you. I love you. Bye.
Amen.